The storm howled through the park, snow cutting sideways like shards of glass. In the middle of the frozen field lay what looked like a mound of ice and fur. At first glance, it seemed like a dead dog, abandoned to winter's cruelty, body stiff beneath the swirling flakes. Yet as the wind broke for a moment, something beneath the thick chest of the animal faintly stirred. A fragile motion, so small it could have been mistaken for a trick of the storm. That fleeting tremor became the first sign that this was no lifeless carcass, but a desperate shield holding on against death itself. For anyone passing by, it would have been invisible, just another forgotten body swallowed by the cold. But in the hollow silence, fate had placed two men on a collision course with this heartbreaking scene. Jim and Ethan trudged through knee-high snow, breaths puffing white clouds into the frozen night. Their boots crunched against ice, each step heavier than the last. "We're insane to be out here," Jim muttered under his breath, though there was no humor in it. They had only ventured for a short walk to clear their heads, but the blizzard had grown teeth, forcing them to cut back across the park. The landscape was empty, desolate. No one in their right mind lingered outside tonight. Yet over the howl of the wind, Ethan's trained ear caught something faint, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. His work with rescue shelters had taught him to separate nature's noises from an animal's plea. He froze in place, straining to listen. There it was again, so soft it barely registered, a whimper that cut straight through the night like a warning bell. Ethan raised a hand, stopping Jim in his tracks. The noise came again, high-pitched, desperate, barely more than a breath carried by the storm. It wasn't wind. It wasn't shifting branches. It was alive. He motioned toward the trees lining the frozen path. Each crunching step forward felt like walking toward a secret the night wanted buried. As they neared, the sound grew clearer, broken, uneven, but persistent, like a fading heartbeat. Jim's pulse quickened. He had heard animals cry before, but this was different. There was weight in it, a human-like pull that demanded attention. Every step deepened the sense of dread curling in his gut. The trees opened to a small clearing, and through the snow, they saw it. The dog, unmoving, covered in frost, curled tightly as if guarding something unseen. The whimper wasn't from him. It came from beneath him. Jim dropped to his knees, ignoring the sting of ice through denim. His gloved hands brushed away layers of snow, revealing fur stiff with frost. The dog didn't flinch. His body was unnaturally still, as though winter itself had claimed him. Ethan leaned down, pressing an ear close to the chest, searching for life. Then came the faintest vibration, a shallow breath. Relief clashed with confusion. This animal wasn't gone, but barely clinging to existence. Jim's flashlight beam caught something else. Nestled beneath the dog's broad frame was a shape too small to be him alone. Something hidden. Jim's throat tightened. Carefully, they shifted the heavy body, their movements urgent yet reverent. And then the truth spilled out in a rush of cold air. Against the shepherd's stomach, curled so tightly she seemed stitched to him, lay a child, a little girl.
The sight cut through them like a blade. A girl no older than 10, wrapped in nothing more than a thin coat, her face ghost white against the dark fur pressed to her cheek. Her lips were blue, her eyes shut, her chest rising so faintly it was almost invisible. Every instinct screamed they were too late, yet the weak whimper that had led them here proved otherwise. Rex's body had shielded her from the worst of the storm, buying time with his own warmth. Ethan's eyes burned, his breath catching in his throat. He had seen rescue animals perform miracles, but never this. This wasn't training, this was sacrifice. Jim slipped his scarf around her tiny frame, pulling her against his chest. The weight was almost nothing, so fragile it terrified him. They weren't rescuing her, they were racing death itself. Snow stung their faces as Jim cradled the girl, her body cold as marble. She didn't stir, didn't twitch, didn't show even a flicker of awareness. Her breath, if it could be called that, rasped like smoke slipping through a dying fire. Panic surged through him. Hypothermia this deep was merciless. Seconds could decide everything. Ethan pulled off his coat, wrapping it around her, while his eyes darted back to the shepherd. Rex still hadn't moved. His chest rose in shallow intervals, breath laboring. He had given everything he had to keep her alive, and now he was fading. Jim bit down against despair, pressing the girl close. This wasn't just about saving one life. They were fighting for two, and both were balanced on the thinnest edge of survival, with time running out faster than the storm itself.
They tried to move Rex, but his body resisted. Too heavy, too stiff from hours in the snow. Every inch of him seemed frozen to the earth, like he had chosen this spot as his final watch. Ethan knelt, sliding his hands beneath the shepherd's chest. The dog stirred faintly, a twitch of the paw, a shallow groan. His eyes opened for a split second, clouded, weary, but still fixed on the girl. It was as if his entire being was tethered to her survival, unwilling to leave until she was safe. Ethan whispered a promise into the storm, though no one could hear. They would not let this sacrifice be in vain. He pressed his coat tighter around Rex before hoisting the dog into his arms. The weight sagged heavily, yet Ethan refused to let go. Tonight, no one would be left behind. The night pressed in as they stumbled back toward the road, burdened by lives too fragile to carry. Jim clutched the child as though she could slip away at any moment, his scarf damp with frost against her mouth. Ethan followed, each step a battle, Rex's body limp against him. Their breaths came ragged, burning lungs raw. The storm fought every stride, shoving them back, filling their footprints as fast as they made them. Jim's mind raced with questions he dared not ask. How long had she been here? How close had she come to vanishing forever? The siren's wail cut faintly through the storm then, a lifeline thrown across the night. Red and blue lights shimmered dimly ahead, distorted by snowfall. Hope surged, but so did dread. Would they reach it in time, or would the storm claim victory first?
Headlights carved through the storm like blades, an ambulance crawling up the icy road. Relief crashed through Jim so hard his knees nearly buckled. He waved frantically, his free arm cutting arcs through the snow. The vehicle skidded to a stop, paramedics spilling out with stretchers and blankets. Jim thrust the girl forward, words lost in the storm. They saw her condition instantly, the silence of her lips, the blue tint of her skin. They moved with practiced urgency, wrapping her in heated foil blankets, rushing tubes and oxygen to her frail frame. Behind them, Ethan staggered with Rex, shouting for help. Another team lifted the shepherd, strapping him onto a gurney meant for large animals. For a moment, the storm seemed to hold its breath. 2 lives, stolen from death's grasp, were being dragged into the fragile promise of survival. Inside the ambulance, the girl's pulse flickered faintly against the monitors, dangerously low. Heated blankets swaddled her as paramedics barked vital signs, their voices strained. Jim sat pressed against the wall, helpless, every beep from the machine like a countdown. Through the rear doors, Ethan watched another vehicle speed away with Rex, the shepherd's chest barely moving beneath the layers of towels. The separation tore at him. 2 lives, 2 battles, running parallel on different roads. The storm swallowed the park behind them, erasing footprints, as if none of it had ever happened. Yet inside those rushing vehicles, the fight had only begun. The hook tightened again. This wasn't just about whether they had been found. It was about whether either of them could hold on to the fragile thread of life long enough to see another sunrise.
The hospital doors burst open, releasing a rush of sterile light against the storm. Nurses seized the stretcher carrying the girl, their voices urgent, calling for warmed IV fluids and heated oxygen. Her body was dangerously rigid, lips tinged violet, skin pale as the snow they had pulled her from. Jim stumbled behind, his scarf falling loose, his heart pounding in terror. Doctors huddled around, reading vitals that barely registered life. One whispered that her body temperature had plummeted close to fatal levels. The room filled with the chaos of emergency protocols, heated blankets, warm saline flushes, machines beeping irregular rhythms. Jim pressed against the wall, his fists clenched, unable to look away. In that room, every second decided if she would return or vanish forever. The storm outside was merciless, but inside this hospital, the greater storm was the silence between heartbeats. Miles away, another fight raged in the veterinary clinic. Rex lay stretched across a steel table, his once proud frame now gaunt and unresponsive. Ethan hovered anxiously, watching as the vet slipped a stethoscope beneath layers of damp fur. The heartbeat was faint, irregular, but present. Severe hypothermia, the vet muttered, as they wrapped Rex in heat pads and threaded IV lines into his veins. His paws twitched weakly, muscles struggling even in unconsciousness. Ethan's chest tightened. This wasn't just any stray fighting for life. Something about Rex radiated nobility, a presence too deliberate, too disciplined. He had stayed with the girl through the storm, refusing to save himself. As machines beeped faint signals of life, Ethan whispered a vow. Whatever history this dog carried, whatever secrets lived behind those weary eyes, he would make sure Rex's story didn't end here. Not tonight.
Back in the hospital, the girl's frail body convulsed in the grip of a seizure, alarm shrieking across the ER. Doctors rushed in, stabilizing her with warmed fluids and controlled shocks to coax her body's rhythm back. Jim pressed his forehead to the glass, shaking with helpless rage. Hours dragged like eternity, every rise and fall of her chest a battlefield victory. Slowly, the monitors steadied, the violent tremors quieting until her breathing found a fragile rhythm. A nurse exhaled, whispering that her organs had begun responding. Jim's shoulders sagged, but relief came shackled with fear. The fight wasn't over. She was still balanced on the edge of darkness. Yet that faint thread of life, pulled back from the void, was proof she wasn't giving up. Somewhere deep inside that fragile body, the same fierce will that had kept her alive in the snow still burned. Ethan's heart lurched when Rex's monitors faltered. The shepherd's breathing shallowed, his ribs barely moving beneath the blanket of wires and pads. For one gut-wrenching moment, the line on the screen stuttered, flattening toward silence. Ethan slammed his palms against the table, begging him to hold on. But his words couldn't pierce the thick fog of fading life. The vet barked orders, pushing warmed plasma through IVs, massaging Rex's chest with desperate rhythm. The clinic was filled with the heavy stench of antiseptic, but beneath it lingered something raw: sacrifice. Ethan realized the dog wasn't dying from weakness. He was fading because he had given everything to protect the girl. His life force had been poured into her survival. Now it was his turn to be saved. The question hung heavy in the sterile air. Would he see another sunrise?
Morning cracked across the horizon. Pale light bleeding into two separate rooms, one where a child lay recovering, another where Rex still clung to life. Jim and Ethan reunited in the hospital cafeteria, both hollow-eyed, their silence broken only by the hum of vending machines. Then came the news. The girl had stabilized. Her temperature had risen to safe levels, her breathing steady. Relief nearly dropped Jim to his knees. But Ethan's face told another story. Rex was not yet safe. His condition remained critical, his body still unresponsive. He was no ordinary dog, Ethan murmured. Jim frowned, sensing more than just exhaustion in his voice. Ethan explained the vet had found an old tattooed mark along Rex's ear, a code once used for working dogs. Suddenly, the truth cracked open like ice beneath their feet. This wasn't just a dog. This was a retired canine. They drove to the shelter where Rex lay recovering, the air inside heavy with disinfectant and dread. The vet handed Ethan an old weathered file discovered after scanning Rex's ear tag. His real name surfaced in faded ink. Rex, German Shepherd, 9 years old. Decorated service canine. His record was a catalog of loyalty and courage, drug busts, rescues, protection assignments. He had been a partner once, a hero. But his file ended abruptly with the note, "Retired, unclaimed." Jim's chest tightened, his eyes burning with anger. How could a hero be discarded to wander cold streets, forgotten by the very system he had served? Yet here he was, giving his final strength to keep a child alive. Ethan clenched the file in his fist. Rex wasn't just any survivor. He was a soldier of loyalty, forced into exile, now rewriting his final legacy.
The hours blurred as Rex fought for breath, his pulse thready beneath the weight of time. Across town, the little girl stirred in her hospital bed, her eyelashes fluttering weakly. Jim sat at her side, whispering encouragement, though she couldn't hear. He thought of Rex in that cold field, lying across her fragile body, keeping her alive with nothing but his warmth. They were bound together now, dog and child, two survivors tethered by sacrifice. Meanwhile, Ethan leaned over Rex, refusing to leave the clinic. His hand hovered above the shepherd's fur, aching to comfort him, but unwilling to disturb the fragile machinery keeping him alive. Two lives fought battles miles apart, yet their survival was inseparably linked. One had shielded the other. Now both clung to life, suspended on the fragile mercy of fate. When Rex finally stirred, his eyes cracked open just enough to reveal their cloudy amber glow. Ethan leaned in, barely breathing, afraid even sound might shatter this fragile moment. The vet adjusted the IV, noting his vitals were climbing, slow, uneven, but real. Then Ethan noticed the scar, a jagged mark running across Rex's shoulder, half hidden by fur. The vet confirmed it had come from shrapnel years earlier during a raid, a mark of service. Ethan's throat tightened. This dog had bled for people, stood against danger, and still had been left to die in the cold. Now, even near death, he had chosen to protect a stranger's child. The scar wasn't just a wound, it was proof of his unbroken courage. Ethan squeezed Rex's paw gently, whispering that his fight wasn't over, not while a little girl still needed her protector alive.
In the hospital, the girl's eyelids fluttered open at last. For the first time, her eyes met Jim's, wide with confusion and fear. She didn't speak, just stared, her tiny fingers twitching against the blankets. Nurses rushed to her side, whispering that she was stabilizing. Jim exhaled a shaky laugh, overwhelmed by the miracle of her survival. Yet the rehook pulled sharply. Her lips moved faintly, and though her voice was no more than a whisper, one word slipped out. "Dog!" The single syllable cracked through Jim's heart like lightning. Even in the fog of recovery, her first thought was of Rex. The hospital staff exchanged bewildered looks, but Jim understood. This wasn't coincidence. Her survival wasn't owed only to machines or blankets. It was owed to him, the shepherd who had refused to leave her side. As evening fell, Ethan returned with the file in hand, delivering it to Jim outside the girl's room. Together, they read through the decorated past of Rex, their eyes skimming over commendations, service notes, and faded photographs of the shepherd in uniform beside officers long gone. The irony gnawed at them. Discarded after years of service, Rex had found his true purpose only in the wildest twist of fate. Jim's chest ached as he imagined the child's unconscious whisper, her desperate memory of his warmth. The story was undeniable. This dog wasn't just her savior, he was her guardian, chosen by destiny to shield her through the storm. Yet the payoff was still incomplete. Rex still lay in critical condition, and the question burned hotter than ever. Would this decorated hero live long enough to know what he had saved?
The girl's strength grew by inches, each breath steadier than the last. Jim remained at her bedside, holding her hand as nurses adjusted her IV. Hours earlier, her body had been as cold as stone, but now warmth crept slowly into her cheeks. When she finally smiled, frail but real, Jim felt his heart break and mend in the same moment. Doctors whispered that recovery would be long, but her survival itself was a miracle. Jim whispered thanks to whoever had carried her through the storm, but deep down he knew. The shepherd's warmth had shielded her through the night. The child's fragile smile was more than relief. It was a message. Somewhere across town, the hero who had given her this chance still clung to life. The bond between them was unspoken, but stronger than any words the world could provide. At the vet's office, Rex's chest began rising with steadier rhythm. His amber eyes flickered open wider, scanning the strange lights above him. For a moment, confusion shadowed his face, as though he expected to see an old partner at his side. Instead, he found Ethan leaning close, whispering encouragement. The vet confirmed his vitals were improving. His body remained weak, trembling with every breath, but the worst had passed. Rex had chosen survival yet again. Ethan exhaled, tears brimming in his eyes, overwhelmed by relief. This was more than medicine. It was willpower, a soldier's instinct not to fall when another life depended on him. Somewhere in his fading memory, echoes of commands, sirens, and duty still lived. That same discipline had kept him alive long enough to shield the girl. Now it was carrying him back from the edge. Days later, the storm finally broke, and pale winter sunlight streamed through hospital windows. Nurses wheeled the little girl into a small waiting room for visiting hours. Her mother clutched her tightly, refusing to let go. Jim entered quietly, his coat still damp with snow. He told her softly that the shepherd who had saved her was alive. At the mention of Rex, her eyes widened, the first spark of excitement piercing the exhaustion in her gaze. Ethan soon arrived, leading the vet staff carrying Rex carefully on a stretcher. His fur had been cleaned, his body frail but dignified. When their eyes met, the child and the dog, the room fell into reverent silence. She reached out, trembling, and Rex's nose twitched weakly as he pressed it to her hand. In that instant, two survivors reunited, bound by a storm-born bond no power could sever. When doctors asked the girl if she remembered the dog's name, she hesitated, then shook her head. Rex's identity had been buried beneath scars and years of abandonment. But Ethan stepped forward, holding the weathered file. He read aloud the name that had once commanded respect in precinct halls: Rex. At that word, the shepherd's ears flicked, his head lifting weakly as though reclaiming an identity lost to time. The child whispered it too, softer than breath, but clear. Rex. Tears welled in Jim's eyes as he watched her fingers curl into the shepherd's fur. In that moment, past and present converged. An old soldier's service and a new life saved. The name wasn't just a label, it was a restoration of honor. Rex wasn't a forgotten stray anymore. He was remembered, recognized, and cherished again, exactly as he always should have been.
The girl's mother wept openly, thanking Jim and Ethan, her voice breaking with gratitude. She confessed she had prayed through the night, terrified her daughter would never return from the storm. And when she saw Rex, frail but alive, her tears deepened. She didn't see just a dog, she saw the guardian who had given her child back. She bent low, pressing her hand gently to Rex's paw, whispering thanks through sobs. Ethan, overwhelmed, stepped aside, unable to watch without tears of his own. For years, Rex had been denied a family's love, but in that small hospital room, he received it in waves. The girl clung to him, her tiny frame pressed against his. It was a reunion that healed not just bodies, but broken faith. Gratitude filled the air like warmth, rising higher than the storm clouds that once threatened their lives. Just as relief settled, a twist arrived. A retired officer walked into the hospital room, uniform neat despite age. He had received a call about Rex's identification tag. The man froze when he saw the shepherd, recognition flashing in his eyes. His voice cracked as he whispered that Rex had once been his partner. Years ago, they had faced raids, rescues, and danger together. But when the officer retired, Rex was sent into the system, unclaimed. His voice trembled with guilt. He thought Rex had been adopted into a safe home. Instead, the dog had wandered, alone. The reunion hit like lightning. Rex stirred at the sound of the man's voice, ears perking, eyes shining faintly with memory. The officer fell to his knees, stroking Rex's scarred shoulder. A bond once broken was restored, but now tested by the shepherd's fragile state of survival.
The officer's presence brought weight to the room. He recounted stories of Rex's heroics, tracking lost children, intercepting criminals, standing firm in gunfire. Each word painted the picture of a warrior who had lived to protect. The child listened wide-eyed, as if hearing the legend of her rescuer for the first time. Doctors and nurses paused at the door, silently honoring the shepherd as though they stood before a decorated veteran. The officer raised his trembling hand in salute. Rex, though weak, lifted his head and gave a faint wag of his tail, a soldier acknowledging one last order. Tears filled the room. It wasn't just a reunion, it was recognition. For years forgotten, Rex's service was now remembered not in dusty files, but in living hearts. The shepherd wasn't fading into obscurity, he was ascending into legacy. The officer looked at the child, then at Rex, torn by guilt and gratitude. He confessed he could never take Rex back. His health was failing, and the dog deserved more than to watch another partner fade. But he also knew this child and her mother needed Rex as much as he needed them. The decision hung heavy until the mother stepped forward. She promised Rex would have a home, warmth, and love for however many days remained. Jim and Ethan agreed, their eyes shining with conviction. The officer placed his hand on the girl's shoulder, declaring it was right. Rex had already chosen his new family the night he shielded her from the storm. There was no debate left. His loyalty had made the choice. From that day on, the shepherd belonged not to service, not to records, but to love. Weeks later, Rex returned to the child's home, greeted not as a stray, but as family. His fur had thickened again, his ribs hidden beneath healthy weight, though his age still showed in the gray around his muzzle. Neighbors gathered quietly, moved by the story whispered through town, the canine who saved a girl in the storm. The child clung to him, her laughter filling the air, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. For the first time in years, Rex slept on a soft bed, not concrete. His dreams carried him through fields of memory, sirens fading, storms passing, his heart finally at rest. He was no longer forgotten. He had returned home. The storm that had nearly ended 2 lives had instead forged a bond unbreakable. Rex's story was no longer hidden, it was alive, carried by every heart he had touched. Months later, Jim, Ethan, and the girl's family gathered in the park where it all began. Snow had melted, grass greening beneath the sun. Rex, slower now but proud, padded beside the child. Together they stood at the very tree where he had once curled around her fragile body. The girl knelt, hugging him tightly, whispering thanks in her own way. Ethan snapped a photograph, a soldier reborn not in uniform, but in love. The officer, frail but smiling, saluted once more, tears glistening in his eyes. Everyone there understood. The storm had not ended a life, it had written the final chapter of a hero. Rex Canine, once forgotten, was now immortal in memory, a guardian who had shielded innocence when the world turned cruel. His legacy was carved not in medals, but in the heartbeat he saved. And that heartbeat would carry him forever.